You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley, and we have my wife, Cassandra, again. How are you?
Good. How's it going?
It's Labor Day.
Yes, that's right. The year went by so fast.
Yeah, so that means summer's coming to a quick close. So we're going to normally we do the fall checklist a little bit later, but I decided to do it a little earlier this year just because I think doing it in October is probably not the best.
Well, and life gets so busy that it's good that you're doing it in September so people can schedule their fall checklist in October and clear the time.
Schedule what?
Like 3-4 hours, whatever it takes.
Oh, I thought you meant like schedule an inspector or
No,
something.
because you think about it, people get so busy with Halloween, if they have kids, with Thanksgiving, with Christmas.
Yeah.
And so I think September is actually good to do this episode.
Yeah. So, we do this every year. I pretty much probably go over about the same things. Obviously, we, talk about one of the most talked about things I hear lately when we're doing the fall checklist. And one of the interesting things we're going to do in a few weeks, but we're going to talk about people's habits and children's habits, adults' habits. And it's interesting that, doing this episode, it's something I kind of wanted to just bring up to our listeners. Like it's a very difficult thing as a mold inspector, mold specialist, IEP, whatever you want to call what I do. It makes it very difficult for us to do our jobs if we don't understand the habits of the people in the home.
Well, that's true, because the habits then lead to what you find when you're doing the fall checklist.
Exactly. So anyhow, with the checklist, like I said, we kind of do this. Usually we would do it around daylight savings time, and then we talk about changing the clocks. But now that we're doing it a little bit earlier, you can, like you said, by us talking about it, they can get it scheduled. But this checklist, in my opinion, it's kind of just like an inspection. But when you think of the fall checklist, like what are the main things you think about?
Well, I think about time. I think it takes, about 4 hours to do this? Sometimes people think checklist and it's like, check, done in 10 minutes. This is not a 10-minute procedure. This is a half a day kind of thing.
Yeah. If you did a full inspection, I would say that. But I think for our listeners, if they did this checklist, they could probably go through it and do it in an hour or two. But you would probably have to have one of your kids helping you, or your significant other. One of you tackles the outside and one does the inside.
Exactly.
But I always start, just like with inspections, we always start with the exterior. And the reason I do that is, of course, our listeners, this is their home, so this isn't something new. Whereas as an inspector, for me, this is a property I'm not familiar with. But if I do the outside first, the defects I find on the outside coincide with the areas that I'm going to pay attention to on the inside. Does that make sense?
It does. I also think with weather. I mean, it may look really great at 9 a.m., but in certain places by 11 a.m., you might now have rain or snow.
Exactly.
And so it's good to get the outside done when the weather's good.
Exactly. And, I guess my point is for our listeners, if you're doing your inspection of the roof and you see some missing shingles in that house, I would pay more attention to the area that's below that. So, if it's your living room, your kids' bedroom, if it's right below that, pay attention to that ceiling in there. Because I would assume most of our listeners aren't going to get on the roof. But that's what I'll start with. So, in my opinion, you should be checking the roof. The few things you want to check on the roof. Shingles, make sure there's none missing. If you have a metal roof, make sure everything looks good. There's no spots that aren't, the paint's peeling or something like that. Then the important thing on the roof, in my opinion, is the gutters. If you don't crawl up on the roof, you're probably not going to know if those gutters got debris in it. But that's an important thing, is to check the rain gutters. For our listeners that don't want to get up there and check the rain gutters, during a rainstorm, just go outside and see if water's coming out of the downspouts.
That's a good way to do it too.
And, you want to check your soffits, make sure everything looks good there. As far as down on the ground level, you're wanting to look at the grading and drainage. That's one of the most important things, is your grading around the home. You want to make sure it slopes away from the house for a minimum of 6 feet, meaning the hard surface, which you're not always going to see, should be sloped away. And, you'd be able to tell looking at your foundation, check your foundation for cracks. For our listeners, because it's fall, make sure you unhook your hose bibs. Right now, this time of year is probably a little too early.
But come October.
Yes, come October, make sure in Wyoming, for the most part, stuff starts freezing depending on where you live in just a couple weeks.
Exactly.
So, but keep that in mind. That's one of the most problematic things I see in the spring from moisture intrusion events, besides normal flooding due to improper grading, is a hose bib that froze over the winter.
Okay. So yeah, that's an important thing to make sure is handled.
You unhook it.
Yeah.
Yep. And, for our listeners, there's obviously different things you can do personally, depending on where you live. If you live in Florida, you probably don't have to worry about it. But if you live somewhere in Wyoming or Alaska or in the northern states, Michigan or somewhere like that, once you unhook that hose bib, you can actually buy, it's this little insulated box that you actually put over the faucet itself.
Oh, okay.
These days, most municipalities, I say most, I would hope the ones in the colder climates, they require a frost-free spigot.
Okay.
And so it's just how it's set up that it won't freeze and burst. But my whole point is for our listeners, make sure you unhook that hose bib.
Absolutely. Or you have frozen pipes?
Yeah, what typically happens is the water in the pipe will freeze over the winter. And when it freezes, obviously when something freezes, it expands. And even with poly or PEX, usually the water faucet itself is copper, and copper's not designed to expand like PEX is. And so what happens is the water in there, it doesn't drain out properly. It'll freeze in the winter. It expands that copper, splits the copper pipe. Well, you don't know about it till you turn it on in the spring. So it doesn't start just leaking immediately is my point. Then you turn it on in the spring and, water starts running down your walls. Wow. So it's very important to make sure you pay attention to that. So then when you go, you do the outside, check all your hard surfaces. So your sidewalks, your foundation, your brick, your grout, stucco, all sorts of things like that. Check all of those areas for cracks. Once again, our listeners know their homes. If you see the same type of crack in the same place and it's not getting any worse, you shouldn't be too concerned.
Okay.
Now, depending on where the crack is, whether it's a foundation wall or a sidewalk or stucco, would determine, what you should do. But if you have any cracks, make sure you seal those cracks to prevent any moisture intrusion from coming in.
Got it.
And so once you're done with that, check all of your doors and windows, make sure none of your windows are cracked around the windows, make sure that there's silicone around the trim. Do the same with your doors. Make sure inside the house, but at the exterior door, see if you can see any gaps or anything coming in. But once you have all that done, then I jump to the inside. And so, like, I'm kind of going through this like a inspection, but also like a checklist.
So is the fall checklist also getting ready to move from like the things you used in the summer, like the lawnmower, to stuff that you're going to use in the fall, like the leaf blower?
Well, and, that's a good point to bring up. Like, for our listeners, in the fall later, not in September, make sure that, you do start cleaning up all that stuff, put your lawnmower away. But yeah, like you said, get your fall stuff ready. Those that have trees around their property, leaves can cause a lot of problems with gutters. Mm-hmm. So that's a good point. When you get inside the house, this is just my opinion, but you get inside the house, I always start with the attic or the crawl space. And we've talked about this before, and like you've said, for our listeners that do not want to go into a crawl space or an attic, if you can, try to hire somebody that will, even if it's a handyman. And when they go up in the attic, what you want to be looking for is proper ventilation, meaning you can feel the airflow. Stagnant air up in your attic is going to cause mold issues because you have no ventilation. That's one of the most important things when we're trying to prevent mold is ventilation. Hopefully for our listeners, they have listened in the past and they have is it Bluetooth is what it's called?
Yeah, Bluetooth.
Humidity gauge.
Yeah, the Govies.
Yep. And, hopefully they have one of those up in their attic. They can change the batteries out on it. Explain to our listeners, you actually bought the Govies. Explain to them what you like and don't like and why you would want them. Well,
it keeps track of humidity so you can see what the average humidity is in different areas where you put the humidity gauges, and it tells you it also can alarm you if something dramatically changes.
Yeah.
So I just like it simply for the tracking and the alarm function.
Yes, you're very data-driven person. And you have the app on your phone, but for our listeners, like we have, did you buy a 3-pack?
A 3-pack. It came with the 3-pack, yep.
Okay. And you just download the app?
Exactly.
Program it to each unit?
Yep.
Each unit you put on your phone where it is. And then, like you said, you mentioned it has alarms, correct?
Yeah, so it'll notify you if something is like wrong, off with the humidity.
Do ours ever go off?
No, never.
What do you have them set at?
I don't even remember, but I know you told me anything above 60% humidity, like at 60, right?
Exactly.
Mold can grow, so I'm pretty sure it's below that.
Yeah, I probably told you 50 or 55.
I think you probably told me 55.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious.
But I wouldn't advise anybody sending it at 60.
No.
You're too late then.
Yeah, no, and that's a good point to bring up. For our listeners, mold, now, of course, it's 3 main things. When I talk about the 3 main things that mold needs to colonize, reproduce, mold infestations to grow, get larger, it needs the mold spores themselves, which we don't even really address because you can't get rid of that. It needs the humidity above 60%, depending on the type of mold that it is, 24 to 48 hours. In my opinion, I think it needs more like 48 hours for it to start reproducing. And then it needs a food source. So the food source is cellulose materials or organic materials, porous materials, sheetrock, insulation, mattresses, things like that is what it needs to grow. If you get rid of one of those 3, the mold can't reproduce and get bigger.
There you go, which is why you say in an attic you need to check for ventilation.
Exactly.
To make sure that there's circulation of the air.
Exactly. And for our listeners, even as an inspector, obviously as an inspector, a mold inspector, we will walk around the attic area if we believe it's safe. But for our listeners, if you have blown-in insulation up there, it makes it very difficult to walk around in an attic. And if you don't know what you're doing, don't do it.
Exactly.
Because you will fall through that ceiling below.
Yep.
And then you'll be mad at me and say, well, Steve's the one that told me to do this. So, other issues in the attic that I would check is make sure there's no pet infestations. You grew up in the Northeast and they have a lot of possums and
raccoons and rats and
yeah, big mice compared to what we're used to. But, you would look for urine stains up there. You can tell, like, once you get up in an attic, especially with insulation, you can see, like, most insulation it'll get darker. A lot of insulation's pink. It'll look like more like a darker brown, blackish color when it gets wet. And for pest infestations, mice love to take insulation from this corner and move it over there. And I guess my point is it's not hard to look across the attic with a good flashlight and be able to tell. You would see mice droppings and stuff like that. So check for those things in your attic. Another thing to check for is water stains on the subroof, which would be above you.
Okay.
Check all that. Make sure also that up in your attic that for most, depending on the style and type of home it is, most exhaust fan ducts for the bathrooms are up in the attic. So make sure you'll see that little flex tubing. Mm-hmm. Make sure that those go to the exterior. They don't just terminate in the attic.
Okay. Because then that just keeps it all in the attic.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the point, a lot of people call it a fart fan, but the point of an exhaust fan is to control the humidity. And if you're taking that humidity from the bathroom and putting it right up in the attic, you're just going to have a mold
problem in the attic.
Yeah. And for our fellow remediation contractors out there, I'm sure they'll agree with this, but mold remediation in an attic is not fun. And it's expensive and it's a lot of work. Yeah. So for our listeners, just make sure that, everything looks good up there. If you're on our email list, I email this checklist. So for those of you that are listening and you're not signed up, they can get the mold investigation checklist, how to hire the right
sheet, and how to hire the right mold contractor.
Exactly. So once you're done in the attic, if you have a crawl space, go check the crawl space. Similar things you want to be looking for in the crawl space. Look for standing water. Shouldn't have any standing water in the fall. That's more common in the spring. Once again, check for pest infestations, mice, snakes, all sorts of stuff. Then check again for mold. If you have a vapor barrier in your crawl space, make sure that's on, especially a conditioned crawl space. Make sure all the plastic looks good. You don't see any standing water. And then if you have a Govee down there, go check that, change the batteries out if you've got to do that. And then make sure there's proper ventilation. And so then after that, go back into your interior. One of the things that for our listeners, if they've had mold issues, one of the most common mold concerns we find is in the HVAC system. And that can be, a lot of times it's the coil that's above the furnace and in the ducts. But what I always recommend in the fall, and I don't know the price these days, but I remember, several years ago, for probably $150, you can hire the gas company, if it's a gas furnace, or an HVAC company, and they'll come out and do an inspection of the furnace. So have your furnace inspected. I always recommend NADCA certified, or they follow those standards. That's for duct cleaning. For our listeners, you should have your ducts clean every other year or sooner if you need it. Make sure you change out that air filter on your furnace. That's a very important thing. In your mechanical rooms, you want to check the water heater, check for mold, change the filter on your furnace. Make sure it's a MERV rating of at least 11, or make sure it's a HEPA filter. If you have a fireplace, make sure you get that cleaned. House fires are very common in chimneys because of creosote buildup. A lot of municipalities, you can call your fire department and they will actually come out. You don't call 911, but they'll schedule and they'll come out and do a free inspection of your fireplace.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, typically it's a free service, but, check your water heater, make sure you have a drip pan below it. Make sure the bottom of it's not rusting out. Check your smoke detectors. That's obviously a really important thing. Check your CO detectors, which is carbon monoxide. A lot of times in newer homes, it's code. You have to have the smoke detectors hardwired and battery backup. So make sure you change those batteries out. I say that, but we don't change ours till they start chirping.
Is this also where you would check your Luft monitor, your water alarms? I mean, is that part of a fall checklist?
Yeah. Yeah. So, for a water alarm, those are devices that you probably put either in your crawl space, by your water heater, in your mechanical room, maybe in the laundry room. Make sure, and those are typically Some of them are just hardwired, so you plug it right into an outlet. Some are battery backups. Your Luft, you should get a email every quarter from Sunradon. They will send you that. So you always are telling me, hey, our Luft's red, which most of the time, what is it?
CO2, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of times we think it's from the dog. TVOCs, they fluctuate a lot, but we have it right off the kitchen?
We do.
So
Yeah,
that
right off
probably
the bat.
doesn't help. But, for all our listeners, make sure you do change batteries out on things you have to. A Luft, you don't have to, but a lot of the water alarms, the GoVs, you do have to do that. For our listeners that have a whole home water monitoring system, which what that is it's literally hooked up to the main water shutoff. And it's, they have them these days where it's on an app that you can literally monitor the water flow. And if you're on vacation in Florida, you can actually have it shut off.
Okay.
But if you have one of those, for our listeners, during this checklist, make sure you go check it out. Make sure there's no leaks or anything going on with that. Also, check all your fire extinguishers. Go over your fire escape plan with your children, even if they're adults. Make sure everyone in the home understands what they're going to do.
Absolutely.
It reminds me of like when we go places out in public, I always say to you, like, if something was to happen, where would you go? Like, if there was some sort of shooting or if there was an earthquake, like it's very helpful in your home. In Utah and Wyoming, we worry about earthquakes. In the Northeast, what did you guys worry about the most?
Hurricanes sometimes, but really like blizzards.
Oh, okay.
And like water issues because it's off the coast.
Gotcha. I just know, I remember as a kid growing up, we always did earthquake drills, and because in Utah, there's the Wasatch Front. Supposedly it's like right on a fault line. But my whole point is with our listeners, go over your fire escape plan with your kids, your parents, whoever's in your home, so that they know what they're going to do if there's a fire.
Agreed.
And, like for, 5-6-year-olds, it's scary as it seems to them. Like if you go over it with them, like if there's a fire in your room and you're on the second level, here's the ladder and here's what you have to do. So make sure you go over that is my point.
Yeah.
And, going through your home, and this is more of the inspection side, go everywhere where there's water. Check below the sinks. Check the walls, the ceilings for water stains. Check around the windows. Make sure there's no water stains around the windows. Check for cracking in the walls. Because once again, cracking is natural and it's going to happen. But if cracks keep getting worse, that tells us there's a moisture concern. There's a lot of little things like that you can do, but mainly, below your kitchen sink, below your bathroom sinks, like check all those areas. If you have cabinets that have a gap between the bottom of the cabinet and the floor, check underneath those and make sure there's no mold on the backside. There's a lot that our listeners can do that will help prevent mold concerns. And, when we get into the indoor air quality part, that's when we start talking about air testing or EMA testing and things like that. So just make sure you go through your home and check things like that to make sure that you don't have any discoloration or things like that on the walls that would indicate any moisture.
Okay.
We talked about the Luft a little bit, but for those listeners, I'll put a link in the description. But there's the Luft Indoor Air Quality Monitor. It monitors 6 different things: temperature, humidity, TVOCs, ECO2, air pressure, and radon levels. So they can buy those. You pay more attention, I think, to the Luft than I do. But
it also has an app and it tracks data, which is
exactly. Good. And for our listeners, if you buy it through the link that I'll post in the description, for 1 year, you have to send them to me. I will overlook your results and analyze them and give you, it's not a report. I just send you an email that says, hey, it looks like your humidity is a little high. Hey, it looks like your radon's high. Hey, your TVOC's, like, it's just very helpful.
Absolutely. Getting expert analysis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. And so, the last thing I wanted to cover is an EMA test. For our listeners, an EMA test is environmental mold and mycotoxin assessment. We sell them on the site. I think, what is it, $440? $450?
I think so.
I can't remember. We just changed it because of increasing costs. But for our listeners, the Emma test is a mold species and a mycotoxin. So it's two different things. They can order it right through our site. We have the kit sent to them from the lab. It's a DIY thing. They gather dust like they do for an ERMI. They send it off. Once we get the results, I send them a report. The report will tell them you have this, this, and this for concerns, or everything looks good. And I'll put a link for that in the description too, but they can go to the website and purchase that.
Awesome. So what's your call to action for people?
By the Emma test.
There you go.
It's something, and besides the checklist we just went over, like make sure you do this checklist.
Well, yeah, do the checklist, get a Luft, get an Emma test.
Exactly.
Be prepared.
Exactly. I appreciate all you listeners. I hope you had a wonderful weekend, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also on cnccontractorservices.com find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.